Good day, philosophers, and welcome to another video where we discuss René Descartes' Discourse on Method. In our last set of videos, we finished about halfway through part 4, where we saw the culmination of Descartes' attempt to arrive at a foundation for philosophy. And yes, he found a foundation. And his foundation was in the fact that he could not doubt that he is thinking. And that because he is thinking, he must exist. And that famous statement, I think, therefore I am. And today's lesson is going to sort of begin by us taking apart that phrase, right? His conclusion, I think, therefore I am, is actually a compound. And what we're going to see is, based on analyzing this sort of compound statement, we're going to see how Descartes in this video tries to build back to the world itself, the world that we experience, to say that there is something that exists aside from just his own mind. Solipsism doesn't have the final say, that I exist in the world along with the other things that it seems to me actually also exist, right? And with this, we'll see how Descartes sort of is able to finally establish what he thinks is certainty in what's strictly speaking, philosophy. Okay, so we're going to start by analyzing that phrase, I think, therefore I am. And then we're going to see how Descartes builds upon that foundation in this video, okay? So this statement, as I said, is a kind of a compound, right? Descartes says, I cannot doubt that there is thinking, right? And you could sit here and doubt if there's thinking. We talked about this in another video. Can you doubt that you're thinking? Well, in order to doubt that you're thinking, you need to be doubting that you're thinking. But isn't doubting itself thinking? Can you doubt that you're doubting? While I'm doubting, I can't doubt that I'm doubting, so there must be doubting happening, there must be thinking, and therefore I am thinking. And for Descartes, one interesting thing there is really everything is reduced to thoughts. And within this I think, therefore I am, everything that we have, all of our sense experiences, I look out my window here and I see a beautiful day. Finally, it's a beautiful day. The days have been rainy and cold, but finally we've got a beautiful day. And I can look and I can feel it and I can see it. When Descartes says it's just like when you're dreaming, all of those experiences that seem like, that they are sensing of a world outside yourself could just be thoughts. But no matter what, even if I could doubt everything that I'm thinking about, I can't doubt that there is thinking. And so Descartes, from that though, draws a conclusion. He doesn't just have that thinking is the foundation, but I think, therefore I exist. Why must I exist? Well, as you'll see right here, right? Thinking implies there is a thing that's thinking. Thinking is an activity of some being. Right? And so Descartes says, I can see very clearly that in order to think, it is necessary to exist, and therefore I exist. Right? And here we see this in the Discourse on Method, page 19, marginal page 33. From we're doing the Hackett translation. I think Donald Kress is the guy's name. Yeah, Donald Kress. But anyway, here we read, and here Descartes reflects on this statement. And there's something very interesting in this progression of thought. He says, when I have thinking, then I also know that there must be something that exists that is doing that thinking. And how do I know that something must exist to do the thinking if there is thinking? Well, he says, well, the only way I know it is because it's so gosh darn clear and distinct to me. If we read here, right? After this, I considered in general what's needed for a proposition to be true and certain. For since I just found one of them that I knew to be such, I thought I ought to also know in what this certitude consists. Why am I so certain? Where does this certitude come from? Right? It says, and having noticed that there's nothing at all in this I think, therefore I am, that assures me that I'm speaking the truth, except that I see very clearly that in order to think it is necessary to exist, I judge that I could take as a general rule that the things we can see very clearly and very distinctly are all true, but there is merely some difficulty in properly discerning which are those we distinctly conceive. So Descartes has this concept of clear and distinct thoughts, right? And what does he mean by those? Well, he doesn't actually give a clear explication of those ideas in this text, but we could generally try to say something like this. A clear idea is something that's like vivid and present to my mind, something that's a very vivid idea. And a distinct idea is like precise and separate from other ideas. And it says, if Descartes says I've got this clear present idea that's precise and separate from other ideas, then that kind of idea is going to be a true idea, because he says that's what psychologically describes why I'm so certain that I must exist. How do I know that I exist? Well, it's vivid and present to my mind that if there's thinking, there has to be a thing that's thinking. And that idea is precise and separated from other ideas. Okay, fine, So clear and distinct ideas are going to be this bridge now to trying to get outside himself, right? So Descartes' going to reflect, how can I show that solipsism is false? How can I show? Of course, the word solipsism didn't exist. You didn't use the word solipsism, but for us, we're using the term solipsism. Remember, solipsism was this notion that nothing can exist, that you can't know that anything exists outside of your own mind, right? And so how can Descartes rebuild upon this very simple foundation, which is the only thing that he knows is true is that he's thinking and that he exists? Well, he starts to reflect on some of his ideas and something else that he knows clearly and distinctly, right? And we'll see that Descartes knows clearly and distinctly that he is not perfect. But well, let's take a step back before we jump into that idea. I mean, you might be wondering at this point, is Descartes just plain crazy? He's sitting here in this, even suggesting a notion of solipsism. He's suggesting that we can't necessarily know that anything is actually real outside of our own mind, right? And so the real question is, does Descartes really think nothing exists outside his own mind? And I would argue, no. That's not what Descartes thinks. He's not saying that nothing exists outside his own mind. He's not telling you that nothing exists outside your own head. If you really thought that was true, then we would probably think you were crazy. But are you crazy? I don't know who. Right? But no, for Descartes, this methodological doubt is really a thought experiment about what he can know with certainty. It's not necessarily about what's true. There's a difference between what's true and what you can know, right? And so, for instance, there's plenty of things that are true that I don't know, right? For instance, there's been theorems in mathematics that have not yet been proven that are yet true. There's realities about the nature of how the universe came to exist, right? That are true that I don't know. Right? There's many things in our life. Like even I could speak to myself personally. I see planes fly, but I don't know how they fly, right? And it's true that they can fly, but it doesn't seem obvious to me how it's even possible. I don't grasp that with my mind. And so there's plenty of things that I don't know with certainty in my own mind that are still true. And so when Descartes reflects upon this, there's something that I just want to point out too, that we should make a distinction between really epistemology and metaphysics, right? Epistemology is really just the study of knowing and what you can know, and metaphysics has to do with the study of being and existence, right? And so when Descartes is carrying us through this methodological doubt, it's a methodological doubt which is intended to help us try to figure out what we can know, not necessarily what's true, right? And so when Descartes, he doubts that we can know anything at all, know that anything exists. He's not doubting that thing exists, right? Now, it might seem like he is, but what I'm trying to say is he's not saying that things don't exist. He's doubting that he can know that things exist. It can be true that things exist outside his own mind. I can look outside and I could hear a little fountain of water running, and I could doubt whether it's there in terms of whether I can be certain about it, but that doesn't stop it from being true, right? And so we have to have that distinction, right? So there's all kinds of things that I can believe and have opinions about that I don't know, right? And he probably throughout this whole thing still continued to believe that the world was real, but he didn't necessarily know it, and that's the key idea right there. All right, so how does Descartes build upon this foundation? As I said, he needs to turn now to his clear and distinct ideas, and he's going to begin with the clear and distinct idea. He's in part 4 of the Discourse on Method. Descartes will now try to give a proof that something exists besides himself. Now, I might wonder, what kind of thing is Descartes going to try to prove exists besides his own self, right? What could be the kind of thing that exists? Like, for instance, I'm drinking some coffee this morning, right? And it's good. Should I start with trying to prove that coffee exists outside my own mind? Well, coffee could just be something that I dreamt up in my own head, where all of my senses can be interpreted as thoughts. Can I say nature and trees and things like that are really real? No, not necessarily. So what kind of thing is the kind of thing that Descartes could try to prove that exists outside of his own mind, when everything that we experience seems like it could just be created out of our own mind, like we create our dream worlds, right? And so the thing that Descartes tries to prove exists is God, right? Descartes says, it almost sounds like I'm like God when we think about his method. So let's read this text and let's see how Descartes sort of comes up with a proof of God's existence, right? And so he says, following this, reflecting upon the fact that I doubted, and that as a consequence, my being was not utterly perfect, I saw for I saw clearly that it is a greater perfection to know than to doubt, I decided to search from the source from which I learned to think of something more perfect than I was, and I plainly knew that this had to be from some nature that was in fact more perfect. Now, just a heck of a lot happened in that sentence, right? Descartes begins with a clear and distinct idea, which is, I am doubting. He cannot doubt that he is doubting. That is clear and distinct in his mind. He might be able to doubt what he's thinking of, but he can't doubt that there is doubting, right? And he knows that there's a difference between doubting and not doubting. And he says that something that's perfect wouldn't doubt. A perfect thing doesn't have any doubt. So what can he conclude from that? Since I doubt and a perfect thing would have no doubt, then I am not perfect. All right. But then the idea is, where does this idea of perfection come from? How do I know that I'm not perfect? How do I know that there is such thing as not doubting, which would be a kind of perfection? How do I know that this exists? And so Descartes says, since I know that I'm not perfect, I must have some idea of perfection, right, in my head, and it must have come from somewhere. All right, so let's keep reading the text, and we'll see how he reflects on this, right? As to those thoughts I had of many other things, I just lost my spot. As to those thoughts I had of many other things outside me, such as the heavens, the earth, light, heat, and 1,000 others, I had no trouble of knowing where they, oh my gosh, I lost my spot. Where am I? I had no trouble at all knowing where they came from, because noticing nothing in them that seemed to me to make them superior to me, I could believe that if they were true, they were dependencies of my nature insofar as it had some perfection, and that if they were not true, I obtained them from nothing. That's to say, they were in me because I had some defect, right? I'm sorry, I got cut off there. But this idea is that everything that I seem to experience as part of my life, just as we were reflecting before, could have just been dreamt up as my dream world. There's no reason that just because a tree is beautiful that I couldn't have just made up in my own head. So all of the heavens, the earth, light, heat, and everything else could just have been created out of my own mind. What could not have been created out of my own mind, right? Well, this is where Descartes continues, right? But the same could not hold for the idea of being more perfect than my own, for it is a manifest contradiction to receive this idea from nothing, and because it is no less a contradiction that something more perfect should follow and depend upon something less perfect than that something should come from nothing, I could not obtain it from myself. Right? So here's this idea. Something perfect cannot come from something less perfect. And for Descartes, this means that this idea of perfection that I have, I could not be responsible for coming up with this notion of perfection. That because my idea of perfection could not have come from me, an imperfect being, right? The idea of perfection has to come from something beyond me. And if we were to follow that line of reasoning, it couldn't come from something that was greater than me, but also not perfect. It eventually would have to come from something that is perfect. And for Descartes, that's precisely what we mean by the word God. When we say the word God, we mean a perfect being, right? And so, to continue, blah, 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 it remained that this idea had been placed in me by nature truly more perfect than I was, and that it even had within itself all the perfections of which I could have any idea. That is to say, to explain myself in a single word, that it was God. You know? So, this is Descartes' proof of God's existence. Now, many of you believe in God, and many of you do not believe in God. And you have good reasons for believing in God, and many of you have very good reasons to not believe in God, right? Maybe you don't even have reasons. Maybe you're just going by gut instinct. I don't know, right? One thing that I'll suggest is, just as an aside, that this particular proof of God's existence, to me, should not be the basis for you believing in God or not believing in God. I think there's fundamental issues with this proof of God's existence, and I'm not going to explore them in this video. The purpose of this video is to really understand Descartes' viewpoint. So, one interesting, the crux of this entire argument is, can the idea of perfection come from something that is imperfect, right? And I would argue that Descartes too quickly says that the idea of perfection couldn't come from an imperfect being. Because one way that I could think of the idea of perfection coming from an imperfect being is simply trying to take away my limitations. I'm aware of myself as a very limited being. I'm aware that I don't know everything, that I can't do all the things that I want to do. I can't run as fast as I want. There's many ways that I am not a perfect being, that I don't do all the things that I want to do. And so just by trying to take away my limitations, I might be able to come up with the idea of perfection. But let's set aside our challenges to this argument for now, just for the sake of trying to understand Descartes, right? For Descartes, he says that based on this idea of my own imperfection, I shows that I know the idea of perfection, and that idea of perfection had to have come from something that's perfect, and that is God. And for us, we're just going to try to see how now establishing that God exists actually really helps him is a crucial step in sort of building upon this foundation of I think, therefore I am, right? And so, all right, what do we know? That God exists besides myself. And so this is crucial. I now know that something exists besides me. And so let's reflect on the consequence of this proof of God's existence in terms of Descartes' defeat of solipsism. Remember, solipsism was that I can't know anything exists outside my own mind. According to Descartes now, I can know that something exists outside of my own mind, and that's God, right? I am not the only thing that exists. It's not just me alone with my thoughts. There is more. There's a thought that I have that actually corresponds to reality itself. So Descartes says, for how does, to this I added that since I knew of some perfections that I did not at all possess, it was not the only being that existed. For if you please, I shall freely use the terminology of the school, but that of necessity. And when he says the school, he's talking about like all of medieval philosophers, which we didn't read any of, which is very sad, but sorry. But that of necessity, there must be something else more perfect upon which I depended and from which I acquired all that I had. For I had been alone and independent of everything else, so that I had from myself all that small amount of perfection in which I participated in the perfect being. Sounds like Plato a little bit, doesn't it? I would have been able, for the same reason, to have from myself everything else I knew I lacked, and thus to be myself infinite, eternal, unchanging, all-knowing, all-powerful. In short, to have all the perfections I could observe to be in God. But I don't have all those perfections. It's God that has those perfections, right? And so God exists. Now, here's this key thing, that God exists by the definition of being the perfect thing. So that God is all perfect, right? And so how does that then help us even build further out to more ideas? So far, count it. I know that I exist and I know that God exists. But I don't want to know just about God and me. I want to know about my cup of coffee and know that this body that I'm in is actually a real thing, that I'm wearing this hat and I'm drinking this coffee, and that the walls in this room are kind of greenish blue, and that there's actually trees and beauty and sun outside. How can I get outside to those things? And so now Descartes is going to draw a connection here between God's excellence and his perfection and his idea, his notion of clear and distinct ideas. And he's going to say God's existence really gives me a further reason to trust clear and distinct ideas, right? For how does one know that the thoughts that come to us in dreams are any more false than the others, given that they are often so less vivid and explicit, right? So how do I make a distinction between being awake and dreaming, right? How can I really do this? Well, God's goodness and God's power and God's perfectness will help me get there, right? He says, and even if the best minds study this as much as they please, I do not believe that they give any reason sufficient to remove this doubt, unless they presuppose the existence of God. He says, you can't doubt, you can continue to doubt that this world is really real until you know that God exists and God's perfect. When God's perfect, God's goodness and God's perfection will allow me to get to the world. He says, for first of all, even what I'd already taken for a rule, namely that the things that were very clearly and very distinctly conceived are all true, is assured only for the reason that God is or exists, and that he is a perfect being, and that all that is in us comes from him. It follows from this that our ideas or notions, being real things and coming from God, cannot, and all that is clear and distinct in them, be anything but true, right? And so we have this kind of circle in reasoning that a lot of people point out here in Descartes, right? We began with this idea of clear and distinct ideas, and based on clear and distinct ideas, we were able to prove that God exists and is perfect, at least in Descartes' mind, right? And then he says, as soon as we know that God exists and God is perfect, that it is because of God that we know that our clear and distinct ideas are true. We've got this circle of reasoning, right? And so, what do we do with that, right? Well, for Descartes, the reasoning is not completely circular, because there was a clear and distinct idea that started the chain, which according to him was the clear and distinct idea that he was imperfect. The clear and distinct idea that he doubted and therefore was imperfect, right? Now, of course, the only way that he knew he was imperfect, according to Descartes, was because God exists and God is perfect. Whoops, down there, right? I'm pointing the wrong way. God exists and God is perfect. And that was what gave him the idea of perfection that allowed him to know that. But for him, at least within his own mind and his own thought process, the notion of him being imperfect comes first. And it's from that idea of perfection that he knows that God exists and that God is perfect. And because he now has God existing and God being perfect, he's got more reason to trust his clear and distinct ideas. And it sort of elevates them to a higher status where he's going to start trusting even more and more of his clear and distinct ideas, just not this clear and distinct idea that he doubts, right? So for Descartes, life is no longer just a dream, right? He says, but if we did not know that all that is real and true in us comes from a perfect and infinite being, however clear and distinct our ideas were, we would have no reason that assured us that they had the perfection of being true. There's nothing without God. There's no way to really fully trust our clear and distinct ideas, except for perhaps the clear and distinct idea that I doubt, because, right? Except, of course, that God causes my idea of perfection. But once the knowledge of God and the soul has thus made certain of this rule, it is very easy to know that the dreams we imagine while asleep ought in no way to make us doubt the truth of the thoughts we have while we're awake, right? So for Descartes, we're not just living in a dream. That solipsism is not the reality of our lives, right? But the key here is, even at this moment, reason is still supreme. Reason is still what guarantees what we say and think, right? We don't just trust our senses. We can't just trust our senses anymore, right? We don't just say that just because our senses give us an idea that seems kind of clear and kind of distinct. Reason says that no sense is perfectly clear and distinct. Reason has to deem the truth that would come out of our senses. And in some ways, this is fairly practical, but it's still kind of deep. It shows the kind of rationalism of Descartes, right? It says, for finally, whether awake or asleep, we should never allow ourselves to be persuaded except by the evidence of our reason. And it is to be observed that I say of our reason and not of our imagination or of our senses. Even though we see the sun very clearly, we should not on that account judge that it is only as large as we see it, right? That seems obvious. We can't, just because our sense shows that the sun looks the size of a quarter, that the sun is the size of a quarter. Our reason takes that information from our senses and draws the true kind of conclusion from it, right? And we can imagine, we can well imagine distinctly the head of a lion grafted onto the body of a goat without having to conclude for that reason that there is a chimera in the world. For reason does not at all dictate to us that what we see or imagine is true. So just because something is, we can see it and we can imagine it, it doesn't make it true. Reason still will have supremacy in trying to get to the actual truth of things. That what is an actual clear and distinct idea? The senses are not completely clear and distinct. But it does not dictate to us that all our ideas or notions must have some foundation of truth, for it would not be possible that it does dictate to us that all our ideas or notions must have some foundation of truth. Every idea must have some foundation of truth, for it would not be possible that God, who is all perfect and all truthful, would have put them in us without that. And here we really see Descartes presenting God as the opposite of the evil deceiver. Remember that evil genius or the evil deceiver? And it was the only reason Descartes could find to doubt not God's existence. The only way Descartes could find to doubt mathematics. How could I doubt that 2 + 3 = 5? He says the only way I could is if there was an evil being, an evil genius that was all powerful, that every single time I thought about math, it caused me to be deceived, right? Otherwise, there's no way to doubt mathematics. And so, for Descartes, we see now in these final parts of the part 4 of Discourse on Method that the evil deceiver is not the thing. It's God. God who is all good and all powerful, who would not allow me to be deceived. And there's always some foundation of truth in all of these ideas that I have. So my friends, this is the conclusion of Descartes' search for certainty. He says, because I think, therefore I am, I can have some trust in some clear and distinct ideas, and I have this clear and distinct idea that I doubt, and I can prove, therefore, that God exists, and since God exists and God is all good and all powerful, God would not allow me to be completely deceived in all my ideas, and I now have a foundation for believing that I exist in the world. Good times. What was Descartes' second goal for philosophy? What was Descartes' second goal for his education? First was certainty, the second was utility. Was there anything very useful in anything we just talked about? I mean, it is useful to know that you exist. And if you believe Descartes' arguments here, again, our goal was not to poke holes in it. It was just to try to understand his arguments themselves. If you're with him and you now believe that God exists, that's very good, useful knowledge, I suppose. But it's not like useful, like how I can build a car that can get me long distances very quickly, or how I can have an internet connection and videos so that I can post video lectures when school is closed due to the COVID-19 virus. Like, those things are really useful. And that seems like a much greater kind of use. And so it doesn't seem how this might be related to Descartes' goal of utility, of usefulness. And we'll see that fundamentally this was not how Descartes tried to get a useful philosophy. It was how he tried to get a certain philosophy. For usefulness, we'll have to turn to part 5 and part 6 of the Discourse on Method, and that's where we're heading next. Friends, have a beautiful day, and catch you on the flip side.